Okay. One more topic we need to talk about is global implications related to personality and values. In previous lecture, last thing we have discussed was whether issues like personality and values have some global implications. And when we have discussed personality, we said that frameworks like, for example, the Big Five framework is transferable across cultures. Okay, but we said that from one culture to another, there are different factors or elements which is not the same, or there are some changes between cultures. This, of course, means that we can use such frameworks, but maybe the results are not going to be very consistent. Why? Because there are cultural differences among those cultures or between different countries. That's why we said that a framework like, for example, the Big Five is more valid when we talk about individualistic cultures comparing the results to collectivist cultures. Okay, when you talk about individualist cultures, here we are talking mostly about Western countries, exactly, comparing, of course, to the Eastern world in general, in addition to other countries. When we have discussed values, we said that values, for sure, it is different from one culture to another, and there are some instruments or tools which is used in order to evaluate values among different cultures. Like, for example, the Hofstede framework. It is one of the well-known instruments which is used in order to differentiate between cultural values among different cultures and countries. Of course, when we talk about Hofstede framework, here we are talking about an instrument or a tool where there are 5 dimensions. Those 5 dimensions we are going to discuss and find out how it is going to differentiate between different cultures. Now, the first dimension is known as power distance. Now, when you talk about power distance, here we are talking about the acceptance. I mean here, of course, the society, up to what extent accept situations like that there is that power is distributed equally or unequally between organizations and institutions. Okay, now what we mean here, that sometimes the power is distributed equally and sometimes the power is distributed unequally or unequally. Here we are talking about 2 situations: low distance power and high distance power. When you talk about low distance power, here we are talking about no differences when you talk about power distribution. Okay, this means that there is more equity here. Exactly. Now, when you talk about high distance, here we are talking about differences in power distribution, and usually here, of course, we are talking about unequal situations. So, the first dimension is going to evaluate whether there is fairness or not, or in other words, as it is mentioned here, whether there is equality or not. So, the more there is low distance, the more we can say here that there is sort of equality. Why? Because the power is distributed fairly according to those people who are having the authority or the status or the wealth, for example, and those who are not. And the same when you talk, or the opposite, sorry, when we talk about high distance. Why? Because there is some sort of unfairness in power distribution between those who are having the wealth, authority, and those who do not. Okay, so this is one of the issues. Now, let us go back to Hofstede framework before continuing with other dimensions. Okay, the idea here, according to Hofstede, is to differentiate between cultures according to some values. Okay, now, according to Hofstede, there are 5 dimensions where we can differentiate between different cultures. Okay, now let us go back here to the first point in order to facilitate our understanding to the remaining points. Okay, here when we talk about power distance, it means that in some cultures fairness and equity is appreciated as a value, and in another culture maybe the situation here is different. Okay, it is different because there is more acceptance acceptance to the fact that there are differences between people who are having wealth and those who does not. In other countries where there is low distance power, here the acceptance of such situation is low. That's why there are no differences considered by people when we talk about those people who are having wealth and those who do not have wealth. Okay, so again here. Okay, so again here to understand how Hofstede framework works. Okay, now the idea here is to differentiate between different cultures according to some main values appreciated by those societies. Okay, now there are societies where there is high appreciation for low distance, and other societies where there is appreciation or at least acceptance for high distance. Okay, so there are differences here between those societies who accept that there are no differences between people who are having wealth and those who do not have, and the same when we talk about authority and so on, and other societies where it is accepted as a normal situation. Okay, so this is expected to influence how people are going to behave. Okay, because the interpretation of fairness and equity is different from one society to another, and of course this, as it is going to influence behavior, it means that it is going to influence performance, of course. Okay, now another dimension is whether the preference here for individualism or collectivism. Okay, when you talk about individualism and collectivism, here there are also differences between those societies where there is acceptance or preference for individuals to be as the main unit here, or when we talk about individuals are the main members who are going to take initiative, do things related to work and so on, or whether we are talking here about a tight social framework where people, there are interrelations, there is appreciation, for example, for family more than individuals, or people they prefer to be members of groups. Okay, so here according to Hofstede again, he differentiates between two types of cultures here, where individualism is an important value, and in another cultures, here we are talking about collectivism as the important value. So those cultures who are more individualism oriented, there is high preference for individuals and their rule. When we talk about collectivism, here there is high preference for groups and their rule, and usually people have tendency or high tendency to be members in different groups. Of course, it might be family or even social groups in general, not necessarily family. Family is one of the types. Also, Hofstede differentiate between two types of society. This is the third dimension here, where there is appreciation here for masculinity, or we are talking about more femininity. Okay, now here again we are talking not about male and females only. Here we are talking about the type of authority and how it is distributed in the organizations or institutions, or of course we are talking about the society in general. Okay, so the more there is appreciation for achievement, power, control and so on, here we are talking about masculinity. Okay, and the more there is acceptance for the rule of females, here we are talking about femininity, where there is low differentiation between male and female in their role in the society and so on. Okay, so there are some societies which appreciated the assertive rule and appreciate control and so on, and other societies where there is some sort of perception that males and females are equal in their role in the society. Okay, now the fourth dimension according to Hofstede is uncertainty avoidance. And according to this dimension, Hofstede differentiated between two types of societies. Those societies who does not, let me say, fear the future, okay, and others who prefer to deal with clear situations in a structured way and so on. Okay, so here there are two types of societies: those who have a value which is high uncertainty avoidance, and other societies where there is low uncertainty avoidance. Now, those societies with high uncertainty avoidance, they do not prefer to deal with unclear situations or ambiguous situations. Okay, they prefer to deal with situations where everything is clear, okay, and obvious. Unlike, of course, those societies where there is low uncertainty avoidance, such societies does not mind ambiguous situations or unclear situations. If we are talking about, of course, Hofstede framework, here we are talking about societies and culture, okay? But if we want to project this idea on organizations, how it is going to affect some of the managerial practices, at least. When we talk about uncertainty avoidance, and of course here we differentiate between high uncertainty avoidance societies and low uncertainty avoidance societies. Yes?
When we talk about low uncertainty avoidance, this means that the manager will be able to take risk and will be able to adapt the change and will not fear from that.
And it is going to affect the decision-making process and the planning process. There are differences here between societies who are oriented more to long-term planning, strategic planning, and other societies who only react to the situations available. And those societies, usually their plans are on short term more than long term. So it is going to affect a lot of managerial practices. The most important, at least, here we are talking about the planning process and decision making process and so on. Okay, so again, this is the fourth dimension according to Hofstede. Okay, now the fifth one is the orientation of the society, whether we are talking about long-term orientation or short-term orientation. And when we talk about long-term orientation, it is similar to what we have discussed as an effect of the avoidance of uncertainty. We said that those societies with low uncertainty avoidance are more oriented to long-term planning, strategic planning. In decision-making, they have more professional decision-making process, which is related to the span of planning and so on. Here, when we talk about long-term orientation, we are talking about societies who deal with the future, let me say here, in an open mind, okay? And of course, such societies, if we want to identify some sort of a relation between previous dimension and this dimension, usually those societies with low uncertainty avoidance, usually they are long-term orientation at the same time. Why? Because they are more open-minded to deal with the future on the long term. Okay. Now, when you talk about short-term orientation, here we are talking about a culture where there is more focus on the present and how to deal with the current situations, and the ability to deal with long-term situations, of course, it is here less, or we can say that it is weak. Okay. Now, again, the main topic, which and that's why we have started to discuss those tools, was whether values are transferable across culture or whether values are similar among different cultures. And of course, it is not similar, because we are talking here about cultural differences. Now, how can we identify the differences between different cultures? We need to use some of the available tools. Now, some of those tools is the Hofstede framework, okay? In addition to another framework which we are going to discuss. Now, Hofstede framework is not designed in order to investigate behavior within organizational context. It is designed in order to identify differences among different cultures, okay? But of course, those differences among different cultures, or value differences among different cultures, it is going to affect behavior of employees within the organizational context, okay? Because usually we have our own culture and so on, and this is affecting how we are acting within our work or within while we are performing different duties and tasks. Now, another framework which is designed for the same purpose is the a globe framework for assessing cultures. Of course, the title itself, it is going to give us an important idea about the contents. Okay, here we are talking, a globe is an abbreviation for global leadership and organizational behavior effectiveness. Okay, here we are more talking about a framework which is designed in order to evaluate cultures and find out how it is going to influence behavior of employees within organizations. Okay. Now, of course, we are talking here about the pure organization behavior tool. Unlike Hofstede, which is more, we are talking here about sociology and how cultures are different from one society to another and how those values might be different and so on. But here we are talking about a tool which is designed for our purposes when we talk about organizational behavior, to find out the behavior of employees within organizational context. Of course, here there are 9 dimensions for the national culture in order to identify how it is going to affect the behavior of employees within the organization. The final conclusion here that the globe framework, it differentiates between 2 types of cultures according to those 9 dimensions. Either we are talking about human orientation culture or we are talking about performance orientation culture. Now, in human orientation culture, the appreciation more here is for human relations. Okay, when we talk about performance orientation culture, here the importance or the preference is more for results, because we are talking here about performance, achievement, and so on. Okay, how this is going to affect what we are concerned with, performance of employees within organizations. Whether the culture, we are talking about human orientation culture, or it is performance orientation culture. How this is going to influence behavior of employees within organizations. Yes?
First of all, I think that the humane part and the performance are somehow interrelated. Because like if we are focusing on the humane side of the human beings that are working in the organization, we are encouraging them for being better people. But whenever we're talking about performance itself, we are saying that the performance orientation would give better results because we are focusing on the results. I mean, if you do that, you are going to get a reward, not just based on your characteristics or your humane side.
Okay, so if there is some sort of integration between the 2 dimensions, if there is appreciation for human relations and there is appreciation for performance results, here maybe we are talking about more ideal framework or more ideal situation. Okay, but anyway, there are again cultures where there is more appreciation for a human orientation, and sometimes in such cultures maybe this is going to be at the cost of performance. Okay, on the other hand, there are other cultures where it is more performance oriented, and maybe sometimes in such cultures it might be at the cost of human orientation or human relations. That's why I said maybe if there is some sort of integration between the 2 dimensions in a more systematic way, because this is the basic concept of motivation, to appreciate people and to appreciate performance. Okay, and this of course we are going to discuss later when we discuss motivation, but we do not motivate people simply because they are employees in the organization. We motivate people, or we give incentives and rewards for people in order to motivate people, to motivate them because they are performing well. Okay, so there is some sort of how we are going to understand the relation between motivation and employees, and this we are going to discuss in coming chapters. Okay, but finally, again, when we talk about personality and values, here we are talking about individual dynamics which is going to influence behavior of employees within organizations. When we talk about the global implications, there are differences. Of course, some of the tools which is used to evaluate or assess personality, it might be used in different cultures, but of course it is not going to give us the same results. And some of those tools, like the Big Five, it is more applicable when we talk about Western countries or individualistic cultures more than collectivism, because it was designed in order to evaluate the culture or the personality of people within a certain country. That's why it is more applicable in Western countries rather than Eastern countries, or in individualistic cultures rather than collectivist cultures. Now, when you talk about values, values for sure are different from, or there are differences. Some societies might share some of the values, of course, for sure, but again, there are differences. In order to understand those differences or identify those differences, we can use some tools like the Hofstede framework, which is more general instrument, okay, or like the Globe framework, which is especially designed in order to evaluate culture to find out its implication on the organizational context. So it is more related to organizational behavior. Okay, that's for today. يعطيكم العافية. That's why, of course, perception is influencing decision-making process. Also, when you talk about decision-making, there are different models. We are going to discuss some of those models, find out when to use each one, what are the advantages, disadvantages of each model. Moreover, we are going to discuss different errors that might influence decision-making process. Of course, negatively, it is going to influence decision-making process, in addition to other issues. So mainly, we are going to discuss issues related here to perception and decision-making in this chapter. Okay. Now, first, let us talk about perception. Okay. And let us start here with the main question, which is, what is perception? What is perception?
It's how individuals organize and interpret the information around them and organize them in order to give a meaning for their environment.
Okay, so when we talk about perception, we are talking about a mechanism where we interpret different situations or things. Now, when we talk about perception, simply talking, it is how we understand things surrounding us. Okay, so in order to understand those situations or things, here we are talking about how we are going to interpret those situations or things, and according to that we are going to issue judgments. Okay, and maybe that's why in this textbook at least there is some sort of linkage here between perception and decision making. Maybe in other textbooks we are going to find it in separate chapters. Okay, but here maybe another concept is here, because of course not only perception is going to influence our decisions, also when we talk about values, attitudes, everything is going to influence us when we take decisions. But here, according to how we explain or interpret things or we deal with, we are going to react in a certain way. That's why it is mentioned here that how we use our interpretation to give meaning to our surroundings or environment around us. Okay. Now, when you talk about perception also, here there are two dimensions that we need to discuss. Okay, our own perception and the real situation, how it is. Okay. Now, when you talk about reality, this means that there are two aspects of reality here. There is the aspect that we understand according to how we interpret things around us, and there is the real aspect of the situation. Which is going to influence us more? Yes?
Not the real aspect, because we are going to judge the persons according to our perception, attitudes, values toward this person. How could we understand this, and then we will judge.
Okay, and that's why we said that the word that is perceived is the word that is behaviorally important, because the reality itself, if we do not perceive it, or if we do not understand it, or let me say, if we do not see it, then it is not going to influence the way how we are going to interpret different situations. So what is important here is how we understand things. Okay, so the most important here reality which is going to influence our behaviors in general is what we perceive. That's why we say that perception is very important, and it is going to influence our behaviors in general. Okay, and this is an important point. The reality itself as it is not so important as how we perceive reality, because how we perceive reality is going to influence how we are going to behave or react or deal with different situations. Okay, now another issue here which is important is factors influence perception. Okay, now when you talk about perception, there are three main factors here. The first one is related to us or the individual. Okay, the second one is related to the situation itself, and the third one is related to the object or the thing that we are interpreting. Okay, so we, others, in addition to surroundings or environment or the situation itself. Now when you talk about each factor, there are different sub-factors here or elements which is going to influence how we perceive things or how we are going to interpret things. Now when you talk about the individuals, okay, of course here we are going to talk about a lot of individual dynamics, like values, attitudes, motives, etc. Here we are talking about all those issues that we have discussed earlier, in addition to issues that we are going to discuss later, okay, like experiences, expectations, and so on. Okay, now all those are factors or elements which is going to influence how we are going to interpret things or perceive things. Now at the same time, there are other things here which is related, or other factors which is related to the situation itself. Okay, now when you talk about the situation here, more we are talking about the circumstances that we are facing. Okay, as an example, like time, when work settings, social settings, issues related to maybe the situation itself in terms of its components, for example, if there are other external influences, for example, and so on. Now the third factor here or package is the target itself, or the thing that we are trying to interpret or explain. And here we are talking about different issues related to the characteristics of the target itself. Like, for example, novelty, motion, sound, size, etc. All those. Here, again, we are talking about the characteristics of the thing that we are trying, or the target that we are trying to understand. Okay? That's the word understand is important when you talk about perception, because perception, in other words, is how we understand things around us, according, of course, to the interpretation or explanation or whatever you like to call it here. Okay, so in general, those are the main concepts which is related to perception. Again, perception is how we interpret things around us, and according to that we are going to issue some judgments here related to the environment and how to deal with the environment. When you talk about perception, there is what we perceive and the reality of the thing. What is more important here is how we perceive things, because we are going to behave according to what we perceive, not according to how things are really are. When you talk about perception, again, there are factors which influence perception. We can categorize those factors into three different categories. The first one is the perceiver, factors related to the perceiver, factors related to the situation, in addition to factors related to the target. And under each category there are factors or sub-factors which is related to each category. Okay. Now, one of the theories that might help us in think about perception and how perception occur is the attribution theory. Okay. Now, when you talk about the attribution theory, according to this theory, we try to explain what are the causes of Perception. We are trying to understand what are the causes of perception. And according again to this theory, the causes are attributed either to external factors or internal factors. So here we say that there are two causes of behavior. There are external causes and there are internal causes. Okay. Now the attribution theory suggests a process here, okay, which is known as the attribution process. According to this process, we observe things, okay, and then we try to interpret those things to understand what is happening, okay, and according to that we can attribute causes, okay. So here, according to the reaction, to the final reaction, we can decide whether the causes are external or internal, okay? And of course, we are going to take some examples in order to understand more how this process works, okay? Now, first, we observe the behavior, okay? This is the mechanism of the attribution process here, okay? We need to see behavior, and according to this behavior, we can judge the behavior whether it is attributed to external influences or internal influences, or external or internal causes here, okay? Now, according to the attribution theory, there are three different situations. According to those situations, we can decide whether the causes are internal or external. Now, the first one is distinctiveness, the second one is consensus, and the third one is consistency, okay? Now, first let us discuss what is distinctiveness and what is consensus and, of course, consistency. Now, the first one. When you talk about distinctiveness, okay, here we are talking about whether individuals at different situations, they behave differently, okay? Now, there are slight differences here between the explanation of those terminologies. Let us first, point by point here, understand what is the meaning of, okay? So when you talk about distinctiveness here, we are talking about different behaviors in different situations, okay? When you talk about consensus, here we are talking up to what extent this behavior is similar to the group behavior. Individuals, usually they are working, for example, with others, okay? Here we need to find whether this behavior is consensus to others' behaviors, okay, or it is different, okay? Now, the third one is consistency. Here we are talking up to what extent individuals are behaving the same way in similar situations. Are behaving the same way in similar situations, okay? So, now, if distinctiveness is high, here we say that the causes are external, okay? Now, of course, if it is low, here we are going to say that it is internal. Now, consensus, it is the same. If the consensus is high, here we are talking about external influences or causes. And of course, if it is low, we are talking about internal causes. Now, consistency is different. If it is high, we are saying here that the causes are internal. And of course, if not, here we are talking about external causes. Who can explain why? Let us take the first one, for example. Distinctiveness, we said up to what extent, okay, individuals are behaving differently in different situations. Now, if it is high, which means that individuals are behaving differently in different situations, we say here that the causes are external. Why? Yes?
Now I will give you the first example and then I can explain. Suppose that that Mr. X arrived at his job late 10 minutes. If he always arrives late, this will be in no distinctiveness because it's usual for him to arrive late. So it will be internal from him, under his control, and the manager will say that okay, he's late, so he came to the work late. But if it doesn't happen usually, or if a person, for example, just late one time a week, so it would be high distinctiveness and will be externally used.
Okay. Yes.
I think the distinctiveness is high because you will be affected from an external factors, because someone who's getting affected by the external factors or something that affected him to behave in a specific way. So I think that this factor should be from outside, because if it's from the inside, he won't. I think most probably it will be like different from someone to another one.
Okay. Now let us think here about the two opinions. Okay. Now you said first, if someone is late for the work 10 minutes, or for example, okay, here we are talking about high distinctiveness or low distinctiveness. We cannot judge this unless we compare it with other situations. Okay. Now, for example, if this individual is late to show for the work, and late to attend meetings, for example, and late when dealing with appointments, for example, and so on. So here we say that there is low distinctiveness. And this means that those behaviors are influenced by the individual. That's why we say that it is here internal influences. Okay. Now, if this individual is only late for showing for work, okay, but when you talk about meetings, there is some sort of commitment. When you talk about appointments, there is also some sort of commitment, and so on. So the behavior here is highly distinctive. Okay, it is different. It is not the same in different situations. So there are external influences forcing this individual to behave in a certain way sometimes, or in a different way sometimes. Okay, now we can explain this in another, using another, let me say here, angle to think about the situation. Not always external influences are related to other individuals. Okay, sometimes external influences are related to the environment itself. Now let me go back to the first example you have proposed. Okay, maybe this individual who was late, maybe there was a problem in transportation, for example. Okay, so he was late. Okay, so it was not influenced by the individual. But if he is late for everything, appointments, meetings, showing for work, and so on, here we say that there is low distinctiveness, and this is an internal causes which is caused by the individual, him or herself. Okay, but if it is in a certain circumstances, in a way, and in other circumstances, different ways, then here